Great. Thank you. All right. Well, welcome everybody. And as Deborah just mentioned, this will be our last text study for this year. So with regard to next year, well, I should say we may have something going on during Advent. Our adult education group is working on that. So we may have some kind of study of some sort, but that's not been decided yet. So maybe something in December. For next year, what I'm probably going to do is first look at where the season of Lent begins, which it starts late next year, like March. And we'll have a study for Lent related to the Lenten theme. And then the question will be whether there's time to do a study before and after, before we hit the summer. So I don't know the schedule for 2025 yet, but it won't be long in coming. I'm working on Advent right now and kind of have to get all that sorted out before I can think beyond that. Okay. All right. So, hey, we have a great story here, a story that I think I mentioned I am learning to appreciate more and more every time I read it. So let's just read it through, and then I'll start with taking whatever questions you have and making sure we respond to them in some way or another while we're here. Starting with Mark 10, starting in verse 46. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and he came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. All right, that's the reading. Let me point out a couple of things real quickly, okay? In verse 46, when it says the beggar was sitting by the roadside, that the Greek term there is to odon, which is sometimes translated the road or the way. The very same word that's in verse 45 and says that Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way. That's the same term. Why the New Revised Standard folks decided to colloquialize it and say he was sitting by the roadside, I'm not real sure. But the problem with that colloquial, that word, is that it doesn't help us see that it's the same word in the Greek text. He's sitting by the way, and in the end, he followed Jesus on the way. Those are the brackets around the story. So that's one translation issue. Another translation issue is verse 47. And so far as I know, I'm the only person commenting on the Gospel of Mark who finds this to be interesting. So it's probably not. I haven't seen any commentators who are willing to give it the time of day. But I am. So this phrase, I'm going to look at my Greek text because I want to get this right. Verse 47, it reads in our Bible, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth. You see that first phrase? When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth. In the Greek text, very literally, the first word kai means and having heard It's a aorist passive participle. Having heard that, all right, and the next 4 words are important. Jesus, Jesus, Ho, Nazarene, the Nazarene. And then you have the verb, is. It's the present active indicative of the verb to be. All right. When you have the verb to be, sorry for this. You teachers are loving this, you know you are. Typically, a verb has a subject in the nominative case, and then the verb, and then the object would be in the accusative case. That's true in English, even though we don't tend to call it that. It's true in German. It's true in Greek. If you have an indirect object, then you have the dative or the genitive. We don't have that here. We have the verb to be. And the verb to be is different from other verbs. There are really about 3 other verbs that can do this, but the verb to be particularly. The object of that verb can be in the nominative case. Okay, called a nominative object. Very imaginative term. It happens often. So first-time Greek translators, you know, in your first year of seminary, it throws them because it looks like you have 2 subjects. They're both in the nominative case, but then when you see it, the verb to be, you know that it can take a predicate nominative. It can have that. That's what we have here. So we have to supply something for this sentence to work in English. And most translations say he heard that it is not in this verb, not in this sentence. Okay, that's supply. He heard that it was, there's the verb to be, only they're putting it in the past tense, not the present tense. Jesus of Nazareth. All right. I think it should be translated, having heard that Jesus is the Nazarene. Okay. Why do I want to translate it that way? Because he's telling us he's not the Nazarene. He's the son of David. I think he's re-identifying Jesus. He's heard that Jesus is the Nazarene, which would make him a commonplace person who's just from Nazareth. There's no great shakes about being from Nazareth. So what big deal is it that he's Jesus of Nazareth? I mean, that happens to be his stated hometown. But having heard that Jesus is the Nazarene, he yelled, Jesus, son of David, mercy me. I think from the start, Bartimaeus is challenging the popular view of Jesus as someone from Nazareth. The word Nazarene is not kind of could be translated Nazareth. It could be Nazarene. It's in the masculine singular form, which is not really what the town always is. So I think it's referring to Jesus, the Nazarene, not of Nazareth. Now, why is that a big deal? I think there's an argument in this thing over who Jesus is. I think we're still contending with that. And I think Bartimaeus is showing himself to be a very good disciple who has a lot of faith. And so anyway, that's just a small little translation thing that, again, I look at commentaries, I look at translations. Nobody seems to want to give me the time of day of this thought. So it may just be me with more time on my hands than I should have.
Are you saying that they were still trying to figure out who Jesus is in the story or in Mark's time?
In the story, I think. Yeah. I think it's an ongoing question in the story. Who do people say that I am? I think that's something that's being negotiated. And frankly, Bartimaeus calls Jesus son of David. Jesus does not say, no, that's the wrong title. He doesn't say that. In chapter 12, he will question whether the Messiah is the son of David or ought to be called the son of David. And I think I mentioned that in the video. We'll have to study that when we get to it. So, but I do think there's an ongoing question within the story, not for Mark. I think for Mark, it's very clear that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God. We have great pronouncements at the baptism, on the Mount of Transfiguration. For Mark, there's no question. But in story time for the disciples and the followers, there's a lot of questions. Yes.
In light of that, then the next verse when it says many rebuked him, do you think they're rebuking him because he said son of David? Is that more connected or just because he's swapping?
Yeah, so see that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Are they just irritated that he's making so much noise and drawing attention to himself? That's how we typically read it, I think, that he's becoming an irritant, so they rebuke him. But if he's making a claim that Jesus is the son of David, we're in Jericho. We're very close to Jerusalem. This is like the last town before you enter into Jerusalem or exit from Jerusalem in a lot of journeys. And you got this guy walking out that Jesus is son of David, which would make him a legitimate king, not Herod. This could be really troublesome. Now, in the next story, they're going to enter Jerusalem and people are going to proclaim Jesus to be blessed. They don't call him son of David in Mark. They do in Matthew or Luke, and they're telling of Palm Sunday. So yeah, it could be that the crowd's problem is with the title more than the noise, but we don't know. I mean, it's kind of ambiguous. And I think our translation and most translations, so I just have to say these folks know this language far better than I do. In most translations, they tend to read it as he's making a lot of noise. He's irritating, so the crowd is trying to get him to stop making so loud. I'm inclined to think the crowd doesn't like what he's saying, not that he's saying. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? But now again, I'm huge caveat, just me thinking out loud with my poor little skills, right? So just take it with a little grain of salt, but at least take enough salt to taste it. Because I think there may be something. All right.
Mark.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that appellation son of David anywhere previously in Mark?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I looked for that.
This is the first time.
In my Bible commentary, it says that this is the second time. They're only, let's see here, verses, they're only place in Mark where it was used and addresses Jesus. It's the only other occurrence is Mark 12:35.
Okay, so this would be the second time, be the first time.
Yeah.
And it's in Mark 12 that Jesus raises the question, why do the scribes say that the Messiah will be the son of David? And then he brings up the question of who's greater, the Messiah or the son of David, because you would never refer to the lesser as the son of. Yeah, that's what I'm told. That's why that's a big deal. We refer to Jesus as Son of God, and we imply with that Jesus is sent from God. Therefore, to some extent, to some extent, I mean, you could be burned at the stake for saying that out loud at certain times in church's history. But yeah, so these are, it's not a common title. Titles are a big thing in Mark's gospel.
Yeah.
And I do think the question, who do people say that I am, is a big thing in Mark's gospel.
Well, I
And-
think
and-
also it's the Hebrew tradition, usually you did address somebody with their name and then either where they're from or their son of, my
Right,
understanding.
but you would never do that to imply that they're greater than the ancestor. The assumption is that the ancestor was greater. And those that follow are the lesser. Kind of interesting. At least in Mark 12, that seems to be why Jesus raises this argument and carries it out the way he does. Jesus does not correct Bartimaeus here.
And he doesn't correct the folks in the Hosanna story in 11 either, when they say the coming kingdom of of our ancestor
Correct, he
David.
doesn't. So that's, yeah, I mean, he subverts the whole power thing by riding on the colt. But, yeah, he doesn't. And, you know, it's just a curious thing throughout Mark's gospel that Jesus, you know, it's called the messianic secret among biblical scholars. I think that's a misnomer. I have an ongoing argument with people about it. But very often when someone refers to Jesus as the Christ, he will shut them down. You remember in chapter 8, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Simon Peter says, you are the Christ. And in Matthew, Jesus says, you're right. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Therefore, you're Peter, the rock on whom the church will build. In Mark, Peter says, you're the Messiah. And Jesus rebuked them, told them to say nothing to anyone. A lot of silencing going on. When demons call Jesus the Son of God, he silenced them. So the whole thing about naming Jesus it's a mystery in this gospel, but it's certainly an ongoing point of argument. So I don't know how right or wrong Bartimaeus is in calling Jesus Son of David. I think after chapter 12, we have to assume he's not right. But in this chapter, Jesus does not bother correcting him. Okay. Your questions, your comments, your responses, what do you want to talk about with regard to Bartimaeus here? Yes, sure.
I grew up, of course, with a lot of healing. The church at that time, evangelical, you know, often people were healed of this and healed of that. And during my growing up years, I had a problem reconciling that, I believe, in my head, how someone could, another man could heal someone, you know, but then you learn with me, a lot of it has been, I believe the basics. I believe in God the Father. I believe in Jesus Christ, that he came to teach us a way to live. And so I let a lot of things that I didn't understand, I just set them aside.
Okay.
I felt I didn't have to deal with them.
All right.
And as an adult, my grandparents were alive till I was in my 60s,
Okay.
which is unusual. And my grandmother must have told me this story 5 times. She said, your grandpa Ben, who was a pastor, worked on the docks in Virginia. That's what he did as a living before he came. And she said, your mother was 3 years old and he was very sick, and we took him to the doctor, Ben. And they told me that he had tuberculosis and one lung was completely gone and the other is infected, and they could do nothing for me. So they sent him home to die. They had just started attending this small church called the Church of God out of Anderson, Indiana, which I come from with my dad, was a pastor. And the men in that church asked my grandma for one of my grandfather's hankies. All the men used hankies in those days. And they took it to Anderson, where there was a man that was a part of that group who was known as a healer. And they anointed the hanky, prayed over it, and brought it back. And then the men in the church put it on my grandfather, anointed him, and prayed on it. The next time my grandmother took my grandfather to the doctor, she said, I can remember, she truly, they were astounded. She said the didn't affect, of course, the lung was gone, but the other lung has started to heal, and he's in good shape. Well, he lived to be 89 years old with one lung and one kidney. But in having that in my life, it did remind me that life is full of a lot of mystery. And so, in a way, is the Bible. There's a lot of stuff that I would never understand.
Okay, so how are you reading this story? in light of
Because
that?
I think that when I read about the blind man, if I didn't have that in my mind, and if I hadn't experienced something like that, I would just have a harder time thinking, Jesus said, okay, you can see now, walk away. And because that's what the story's kind of
Yeah.
enforce.
All right, so thank you. And I'm glad to hear about your grandfather's health. I've heard similar stories. The idea of praying over hankies and taking that comes from a story in Acts. It strikes me there are several ways people approach the Bartimaeus story. One is as a healing story. And when you approach it as a healing story, what you look for are what makes a healing effectual, right? And it's Jesus, of course. I mean, that always ends up being the end. But how does someone end up getting healed in these stories? And we ask that with two things in mind. Number one, what does the story say? And number two, what does that mean about our lives? If you approach it as a healing story, then you're really happy to hear that Jesus says to Bartimaeus, your faith has made you well. There's no demonstration. Jesus doesn't spit in the mud and in the dirt and make mud and put it on his eye.
That's
There's not a gradual healing like with another story where he says, what do you see? He says, I see people walking that look like trees, and kind of can't see clearly yet. Jesus doesn't lay his hands on him, doesn't say, go show yourselves to the priest, doesn't say any of that. Just says to him what he says to the Syrophoenician woman, your faith has made this happen. There doesn't seem to be any physical contact whatsoever. So if you approach it as a healing story, then, you come out reading that Bartimaeus is a hero of faith, as it were. And now you get to circle back and say, but look at this guy, he's blind, a beggar, his name either means son of honor or son of shame, probably son of shame, given his status when we first meet him, all of this stuff. And yet he has faith. And that's a very compelling story.
it is.
A very compelling story. You can also look at it as economically. He's not just blind, poor. He is a beggar. And I'm actually going to take that route on Sunday, so I'll save a little bit of that. But compare him to the rich young man, the rich guy, just a few verses earlier. And his request. Comparing James and John in their request. And that's why I gave you some compare and contrast possibilities at the end of the video. You can look at it as a story that's got some about wealth and power. You can look at it as a symbolic story that whether it really happened, whether somebody was really healed or not, it just kind of shows you what it means to have faith. You can look at it from the perspective of what does it mean to look at Jesus and say, Son of David, have mercy on me. That phrase, have mercy on me, the word mercy is not a noun, it's a verb. Mercy me. That's what he says over and over again. Mercy me. So I'm not sure if the English word mercy, that's how we typically translate. This is Kyrie eleison. We have song in Greek that we sing Kyrie eleison. That's what he's eleison. That's the verb here. Mercy me. You can look at it from that perspective. What is that prayer asking? So there are a lot of different ways to approach this story. And when you approach it from one of those ways, you tend to look and find different things. Let me tell you the one piece of information that I didn't do anything with on the video was Bartimaeus threw his cloak aside. You remember that part of the story? It just sounds, like he just got up more or less, but
And walks to Jesus, but he's blind.
yeah, well, he figured that out. Yeah, he throwing off his cloak.
He's a cute sense of hearing.
Yeah, that's it. Whacking people with a stick, whatever. Throwing off his cloak. That's a big deal. Quite often a poor person, their cloak is their possession. That's their house. That's what they sleep in. That's what protects them from the elements. In the Old Testament, if a poor person takes a loan from you and gives you their cloak as something to hold to secure the loan, you have to give it back to them before sundown, because that may be the only wrap they have. And for a beggar, typically the cloak is the thing you spread out and collect coin. So this is your piggy bank, more or less, right? If somebody gives you anything, they usually throw it on there. And at the end of the time, you just kind of scoop it all and do what you have to do. He threw that aside. There could have been a lot of little pennies and change clanking when he did that. He threw that aside. Remember the rich guy that walked away because he couldn't let go of stuff? He threw it aside. That might be a very significant thing. And I've always thought it was just, dramatic. But it could be he's throwing his life to the wind. His former life, the only way he survived, because Jesus, son of David, is having mercy on him. So it's kind of interesting that the perspective you take makes you look at different aspects of it. Tell me the story of Jericho. You know the story of Jericho.
Walls keep coming around, shouting, and the walls
Right.
tumble open.
Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, right?
Right.
And they marched around 7 times, and then they lifted up their voice, and the walls came tumbling down. Every now and then, somebody would say that the archaeologists have discovered the walls, and miraculously, they all fell straight down. They didn't tip over. Do you have to do that, really? Anyway, you got someone standing outside Jericho yelling. I just don't know if that's an echo of the story of Joshua. Is that why they told him to be quiet? Is the last time someone stood outside Jericho and yelled, walls went down. A lot of parallels, a lot of echoes, a lot of things. Why did they get to Jericho, and then upon leaving Jericho, this story happened? Who cared? Why are we supposed to care about it? Why did Mark take the trouble to say that? That's the kind of stuff I want you to think about whenever you read a scripture like this. Hang on, did you have your hand up?
I did, and it was a little bit tied to what Shirley was talking about, and I wrote down a question. It says, your faith has made you well, and then he also says, your faith has healed you. And I was wondering, in the Greek, is there a difference between healed and well? And how do we interpret?
Right. So I translate that your faith has made you whole. And the verb there is the verb sozo. You recognize that verb?
So.
Soapso. That is the name of Hayes's dog.
Oh,
You should recognize that.
What is it?
Soapsos. I don't know how you'd spell it in translated into English. SOCO, maybe soapso. It's a 4-letter word in Greek. And whenever you read someone was saved, what must I do to be saved? If you wish to be saved, that's the word. Soapso can mean saved, it can mean healed, it can mean made whole, it can mean made well. It's got a variety of meanings. It's very common in the story. And usually when the word sin appears somewhere in the sentence, translator will make it saved from sin. If it's a sick person, they'll usually make it healed or made well or something like that. The word can mean all those things. The very voluptuous word. It's huge. It's got a lot of meaning. And I typically, in my translation, and who cares, but I typically make it made whole, just to try to use a term that works for all of those meanings in my mind.
When Jesus used that, the times he talked to the leper and the woman, did he use that Greek word?
He did.
So
So
it was the same word you.
yeah. So if it's a person who's demonized, then soapso means they're made whole, they're liberated. If they're ill, it means their bodies are made whole. If they're brokenhearted, it means their spirits are lifted up. It's really an interesting term. It's not unlike the term shalom,
Peace.
right? Shalom is typically translated peace, but it means so much more than that. It's a way of saying hello. It's a way of saying goodbye. And it means to be well, to more than just, peace. Peace in the largest imaginative way of saying. It's that kind of word. It means a whole lot of things. So the context usually determines how it gets translated. And in this story, obviously, it's a reference to a blind man now being able to see. And so it typically gets translated healed or made well or something like that, and which I think is fair enough. But like I say, anytime you see it in a sentence with the word sin, it usually ends up being saved or something like that. The same is true for the word, I'm sorry, huge tangent here. Stop me if you want. But same is true for the word translated forgiven. It means to put something away. It translated divorce at times. It can be send away. Anytime it's in a sentence with the word sin, it ends up being forgiven in the translation. And I'm not entirely sure that that's always how it should be. I don't think sin always means the mortal wrong things you've done that is going to bring you punishment. I think it's a way of talking about brokenness. And so, especially when you get soapso and sin together, I think it's not always saved from sin. Like you had some kind of salvific experience on your knees. It just can be that you've been rescued from the consequences of brokenness, of a world gone wrong, of you being caught up in a sinful world. So I tend, again, I tend to try to read those words in broadest terms possible, just to keep a lot of things open, a lot of meanings open. You've got somebody who's just thrown away his livelihood, perhaps. How could be how you read the cloak. You got somebody who sees Jesus as the son of David, which has a kind of messianic tone to it, if not in that term itself. And he is now made whole. He who was introduced to us as Bartimaeus, and let me take a liberty here, son of shame, a blind beggar, is now made whole. That's really a powerful thing. Much more than just now you get to see. I did read a brief commentary about this from the perspective of, I don't know the writer. I don't know what right they have to claim they have this perspective. From the perspective of the disability community. And they said, now I thought they made a number of misjudgments in their commentary, but one was, now he can see, but he still may not be able to work. He's been blind. What does he know? Did he have a craft? Can he get by? And I thought, wow, you're missing some of the real nuances here. He doesn't just see, he's made whole. And he hasn't always been blind. Jesus said, what you want me to do for you says that I can see again. The word for seeing is blepo. This word had a prefix anablepo, which means to look up to, and would indicate that he's not like the guy in John chapter 9 who identified as having been born blind. That's a whole different world. He's lost his sight, and now he's regained it. Anyway, I just the story is just so full of intriguing possibilities. You can go a number of ways, and obviously I'm trying to cover them all. Yes, ma'am.
I thought it was important that the last line is follow Jesus along the road.
Yeah, he disobeyed Jesus, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, and to me, that's his role now, is that he is a disciple that he followed.
A disciple in the very literal sense. That to be my disciple means to follow behind, right? And that's the word for follow that Jesus uses when he says in Mark chapter 8, anyone who would be my disciple, let them take up their cross and follow me. Same word right there. Yeah, but Jesus told him to go, not come. It's very interesting. He faithfully disobeyed Jesus. That happens. That happens in the story. I was really intrigued of the story of the persistent widow. That story, the woman who has a judgment coming to her in her favor, but a judge is withholding it for whatever reason, and she goes and demands her justice, and the judge puts her off, but she keeps coming, keeps harping, keeps screaming, squawking, making noise. And the judge says, even though I'm a hard man and don't fear anybody, because she's constantly annoying me, I'm going to give her justice. That's in Luke chapter 18. I really wish it was in Mark. I think it describes so many of Mark's stories. Luke chapter 18. And the moral of that story, Jesus said, is, therefore we should pray without ceasing. Now, God is not like that judge. The word prayer, not just talking to God, can mean advocating, lifting up your voice for the right thing in a world of wrong things. That's what the word prayer can mean. We've spiritualized it, religionized it, and made it, prayer is just when you shut your eyes and you talk to God, or we collectively talk to God. That is prayer, but it's a bigger word than that. Praying without and not tiring in prayer can mean demanding justice over and over and over again until the world, not mean God, a world which tends to ignore widows, people not in power. Fine, they said, all right, it's your damn justice, shut up, right? Just reaches a stopping point. That's why we keep singing Dona Nobis Pacem. we're gonna keep singing that till the universe bends, right? That's a form of prayer. Demanding the right until until you can't anymore. So, well, how did that start? Your face has made, yes, ma'am.
I know it's talked about it not being a healing, necessarily a healing story. And that's why I come to Bible study, because you get stuff out of it,
Right.
we can. But people that all knew about that, they didn't feel he was healed by faith. They thought he was healed by Jesus. And most of the people that are following Jesus through these stories, it's because he's healed someone. So in a way, they're all kind of healing stories, whether it's healing of the heart or healing of the body. I mean, that must have been kind of his, what do you say, thing about, everybody has that, everywhere he went, they followed because someone had been made well.
Yeah. And that's sure. That's
And you pull
That's-
the other stuff out for us.
right. Well, all I'm saying is there are different ways you can look at it, not that
I
one's
know.
right. But one really interesting thing in Mark's gospel. Why are people following Jesus? That's a real question. And after the healing story, Jesus claimed at one point, "You're only following me because of the breath. Didn't you understand the point?" It should be more than just, "Oh, this guy's gonna feed us. Let's walk around with him." It is kind of an interesting thing that when Jesus calls disciples, he doesn't say, "Come with me and I'll make you all better and do miracles." He says, "Take up your cross and follow me." So there is that is something that does draw the crowd. Jesus seems somewhat suspicious of the crowd. I would say that in this story, Mark is somewhat describes the crowd as being fairly fickle. They're following Jesus. They're telling this guy to stop yelling, either because they don't like what he's saying or that he's saying. And then Jesus says, "Call him." Suddenly the crowd, like Jesus' messenger, "Hey, he's calling you. Be of good courage. Follow him." It seems to be a really fickle thing. And I think the crowd is always fickle in Mark's gospel. Jesus is very popular, but it will be the crowd, and we don't know which crowd. Borg and Crossman argue it's a different crowd, but I don't know the reason for which they make that argument. It will be a crowd that calls for Jesus to be crucified. Just remember that. So, the crowd can be very, very fickle. Yes, ma'am.
When you say he wanted them to take up the cross and follow him, what does that mean, to take
Yeah.
up the cross?
Yeah, that's a great question.
But you say it like you know what that really means something.
I know that that's what he said.
Oh,
And I can say that with conviction, what exactly he meant. So again, let's look at it at a couple levels. I sure hope I'm not talking in circles here, but remember there's story time and then there's Mark writing the gospel time. In story time, it is unclear to me entirely what that means. Take up your cross. Because in story time, Jesus hasn't died on a cross. And yeah, the Roman Empire was known for putting people on a cross if they were blasphemous, not blasphemous, but seditious. But up in Galilee, I don't know if that would be just a thing that had immediate relevance for people. So that phrase seems to be Mark's way of telling the story from his perspective after the crucifixion. Well, after the crucifixion, Jesus died on the cross. If you're the community of believers to whom Mark is writing, Jesus died on the cross. Boy, that phrase means a lot. Take up your cross means that you could well die. you want to ask somebody who's explored this phrase, go to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. When Christ bids a man to follow him, he bids him to come and die. That doesn't mean we all need to take on a suicide mission or anything like that. But it does mean that our primary loyalty in this world is our following Christ, not self-preservation. And if we live in a situation where you have to die for it, then we die for it. If you live in a situation where you have to give away your wealth for it, then give away your wealth for it. If you live in a situation where you have to live for it, then live for it. But following Christ is our primary loyalty. And I think Mark's community, that may have had some literal relevance. And because if Mark is really writing between 66 and 70, that it's a violent time in Jerusalem. And people who are I don't think the empire made a distinction between Jews and Christians. I think they just considered them all Jews. And at least for those in Jerusalem, I don't think that's a community Mark is writing to, but certainly Mark's community knows this is happening. I think martyrdom was a real possibility. So I think I don't know what that phrase would have meant before Jesus died on the cross, unless Roman crucifixions were far more prevalent than I know of, and it was just a real way of speaking about dire threats. But after the crucifixion, it means a lot. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
And do we hear people here said, take up your cross? Because that makes me think, well, my cross is different from your cross.
I think that's got to be true. Yeah.
It's more like suffering, whatever I'm suffering about, I need to
Right.
take it with me in my
Right.
connection with Christ.
It's a phrase that we have given meaning over the years. You know,
Mhm.
bear
that
your
makes
cross
sense,
means
yes.
putting up with your annoying spouse. You know, bear your cross means putting up with your annoying job. Not your annoying spouse, another
We do.
person's annoying.
Did you say that he took a lot of the writings from Peter? Did
Uh,
you say some of the people?
That's one of
feel
the
like-
traditions is
From
that
what?
Peter was the source of these stories. It would be a very humble Peter if that's the case. Yeah. So anyway, all right. I feel like
Mark,
it's been scattershot. Yes, ma'am.
going back, you asked about Jericho, and I think some of us have been there.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Talk to us about Jericho.
Well, I wonder if its significance here, and I mean, you kind of like, they came to it, and then the story is that they're leaving it, so we don't know what happened.
Right.
Did they stay there overnight or whatever? I just remember in our trip, it was important to our tour to go there. It's not that far from Jerusalem, and it seems to me it gets more desert-like. And I remembered as being kind of dusty, but also very agricultural. And then my memories get kind of, I lose some.
At the time, much, I know we came through there when we were with the trip with the Muslims, but there was no particular thing on our itinerary to stop.
It was interesting, it wasn't particularly interesting to them and their religious.
Yeah, right.
They went there, point out to us something that Christians would be interested in.
So
It's
Mark
the oldest
Taylor.
occupied, apparently one of the oldest occupied cities in the world.
Right.
Goes that far back. Yeah.
So Mark Taylor has probably has the most well-known commentary on Mark. It's not terribly read, but it's got a lot of information. His argument is that a place like Jericho, remember, we're coming up near Passover. So a lot of people are making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And as far as Galileans are making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, at least Taylor makes me think that Jericho is kind of the last way station before you get to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And that this would be a very smart place for beggars to be. Because, you know, if you go on a pilgrimage with your Muslim friends, you're supposed to really treat the poor with great respect. And this, one of the signs of your faithfulness is your generosity to the poor. And that would have been true of first century Jews as well, because it's a deep Middle Eastern, long time cultural thing. So this would be a real smart place for a beggar to be on the side of the road.
As you're
At the
going
last
toward-
way station, they're heading to Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
They're feeling really religiously, you know, and they're ready for this
Good spot.
marvelous story. And you got this poor person to here, God, look at that, you know. So Taylor says, you know, this is really a smart place for a beggar to hang this time of year. And so maybe that. I didn't point out in the video, I think it's interesting. I have no idea what to do with it. They go to Jerusalem, they leave Jerusalem. After the entry into, Jericho. They go to Jericho, they leave Jericho. After the entry into Jerusalem, they go into the temple, look around and leave. It's the first time Jesus is in the temple in Mark's gospel. And they look around and leave. End of chapter 11. We're done. Next time he goes to the temple, he turns tables over and causes a ruckus. The first time he just goes in there and looks around and leaves. It's like the world's most anticlimactic ending to any great story. I don't know. I see those as two kind of parallel
Just
observations.
checking things out, what's going on and then.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe plotting. Oh, that's the table that's going down. And, oh, I can see this is where the dove sellers are. They're going, you know. I don't know.
Getting a feel for it.
The end of chapter 11 has always mystified me. Like, why this big buildup for a nothing burger, right? There in the temple. But oh well. Okay. I want to see if there's anything else. The question Jesus asked, what do you want me to do for you? The word translated want is the word, what do you will, right? So Jesus in this prayer, not my will, but yours, that's the word, thelo. What do you want? What do you want? Will for me to do for you? To do is a very common word. This is exactly the question Jesus asked James and John. Exactly the question. They ask for power, and they don't get it. He asks for healing, and he gets it. I just want you to consider the difference. Consider the difference between the man asking how to have eternal life and the man asking for his sight. One of them walks away disappointed. The other follows Jesus on. I'll tell you this about Mark. That Mark, not this Mark, that Mark. I think if he were your pastor, you would never hear a sermon on heaven. You would hear a lot about the reign of God and what that means here on earth. And any reference to heaven would be, that's where God's will is done. That should be reflected here on earth. Not a lot of afterlife conversation going on in Mark's gospel. You will you'll hear some of it in some of the other gospels, and certainly in Paul's writing. Not a lot in the Gospel of Mark. He is squarely focused on the reign of God here at him. And I think that's a really interesting thing. I know that in my preaching, I tend to preach almost exclusively from the Gospels. I don't know why, and I don't know if that's a good thing. I'm just telling you that's how it is. And of all the Gospels, this is the one that captivates me the most. I don't know why, just is.
It's a name thing.
It could be a name thing, you know, Gospel of Mark by Mark at Mark. But as a result, I was told recently, I never or rarely preach on heaven. And I talk about it at memorial services. But my phrase is, in life and in death, we belong to God. And I think that says it all. And I don't know what else to say about heaven. We belong to God. And that's going to be true when we're dead as much as it is when we're alive. And what more do I need? I don't know. There's more to say about heaven from the scriptures. I don't think there's as much more as some people go on and on about. But one reason why I end up not preaching a lot about heaven, it was a question from somebody this week about why I don't preach about heaven before. And, you know, it's a good question. And I think it's because I preach from Mark so much. And it made me step back and realize, I don't think Mark preaches about heaven very often. Whether he believes, I'm sure he believes in it, whatever that means, but his emphasis is that the reign of God is here, at hand.
Yeah.
Trust and believe in it, live in it now. So that's an interesting thing. The young rich man wants to know what he can do to inherit eternal life. He leaves Jesus kind of unsatisfied because Jesus wants him to divest his investment in riches now, and he's just not ready to do that. Jesus will say, you know, your treasure will be great in heaven. So not saying Jesus in Mark doesn't believe in it. I'm just saying Jesus in Mark doesn't go on and on about it. And he does go on and on about the reign of God here now. That's an interesting thing. Maybe I'm just making excuses for why I don't go on and on about it. And it is bothering me some. It's bothering me. I'm just wondering. It's part of the Christian belief system. And it's part of my own belief system. But it's not something that I go on and on about. And I wonder, even using the phrase go on and on about it, kind of indicates it's not a beloved topic for me. And I may need to get over that. Yes, Jerome.
Just, you know, I'm making that connection that's not there. When you take the rich man and have him divest himself of all his worldly goods, doesn't that put him in the last position? And then you have Bartimaeus, who was healed, who was last, who is now first. So am I making some sort of a connection that's not really there?
You're absolutely right. The first will become last, and the last will become first. I think those two stories side by side demonstrate that teaching. Sadly for the rich, joyfully for Bartimaeus, and scarily for us, right? Because we're a little more like the rich man than we are like Bartimaeus when it comes to our life situation. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna say that the idea of heaven is not part of the Jewish tradition. And Mark is really teaching a huge paradigm shift as it is. So I think he wouldn't have focused on the whole idea of heaven or later on. He's talking about what we need to do today.
Right.
How you need to live today. So it just doesn't seem appropriate that he would spend much time and thought on that.
Right. Yeah, so let me just finish by making sure that I'm representing Mark maybe better than I did. It does not seem to me to be an evident part of the Hebrew Bible tradition to think of the afterlife and heaven and hell, all that. I do think most of that theology was innovated during the period we call the intertestamental period. I think the second half of Daniel was actually written during that period, but that's when you get all those books in the middle of the Bible, we call the Apocrypha, Esdras, Maccabees, books like that. It was a very fertile theological period. And that's when I think the doctrine of heaven and the afterlife was really developed. Not that it's not in the Old Testament at all, it's just not central. It's not fully developed. I think it was really developed during this intertestamental period, as was, I think, the practice of baptism. Because you don't see that in the Old Testament, but by the time the New Testament starts, everybody knows exactly what it is. Nobody has to stop and explain why we're doing this. It's just given. That tells me that there was some development going on there. And there's still a holdout group, the Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection. Mark and Jesus are not in their camp. That they fully believe in the resurrection. They believe in resurrected life. There's no question about that. The question is whether they have a fully blown, whether Mark reflects a fully blown doctrine of heaven and hell and all of that. You get glimpses of it. It seems to me one of those things that yes, he believes in it. No, he doesn't think it's worth spending a lot of time talking about. And in a time when life is in peril, he still wants you to take up your cross and follow Jesus. So come what may, that's the right thing to do. So Jesus had the conversation with the Sadducees. And it's really complicated. We don't have time to go into all of it. But he argues that latent in the Old Testament is the sense of resurrection. And it goes back to the story of Moses at the burning bush when God says to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They've been dead for several hundred years. God doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus points out that's the present tense. That's where we get the name Yahweh. I am who I am, right? And Jesus says, if God says I am, then insofar as God lives, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob live. That's my doctrine of resurrection, right there. Insofar as God lives, we live. That in life and in death, our fate is with God. And it's one that we can trust in. And if pictures of heaven are your way of understanding that, that's beautiful. If reincarnation is your way of understanding that, whatever. I feel like the Gospel of Mark doesn't go far beyond that. That resurrection is because God is. And you and I are implicated in that. So anyway, I'm sorry. We got a story here. It's got nothing to do with resurrection. Here I am. No. Okay. Sue Ann can mercifully stop the recording now. Yeah. Friends.